I'm joined by Corey DeAngelis from Reason Foundation, and he also is affiliated with many others to talk about education in America today. So, Corey, talk about your background and what led you to pursue this issue, and why do you think education is such a hot button topic right now?
Yeah, hey, I'm the Corey DeAngelis, the Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation, Adjunct Scholar at the Cato Institute, and Executive Director at the Educational Freedom Institute. I mostly do research on what most people call school choice, or what I call funding students as opposed to institutions, where the money follows the child to wherever they're getting an education, which could be the public school, could also be a private school, or a home-based learning scenario as well. So essentially wherever the children is getting their education. And I got into this, my first experience with school choice, although I went to government-run schools all through K through 12, I was able to attend a magnet school, which is a school of choice run by the government for high school. So you're not residentially assigned to these schools, and they can have selective admissions. And I feel like that had a pretty positive impact on my life trajectory, getting access to that school relative to the school that I was residentially assigned to. Wasn't as high of a quality school, and there wasn't as much learning going on in that situation. So I think that had a positive impact. So that was my first kind of experience with it. Then after that, I went to the University of Texas at San Antonio and studied economics for my bachelor's and master's, where I really started to think about this more in terms of monopoly power being the biggest problem that we see in the K-12 American public school system today, that the public schools are essentially geographic monopolies in that they have a ton of power over their customers or families, since families are residentially assigned to them. And if the families want to opt out and choose something else, there are high transaction costs associated with leaving. You either have to get up and move to another house or residence that's assigned to a better public school, or you have to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees, in addition to what you're paying for the public school through the property tax system. So you essentially have to pay twice. So that light bulb went off during my undergraduate and graduate degrees. And then I transferred over to do my PhD in education policy at the University of Arkansas, where I really started to focus even more so on these school choice initiatives, or like I said before, what I call funding students directly. And my first study there looked at the Milwaukee Voucher program, which was what some people call the first modern day voucher program in the US. It started in 1990. So it's been around for about 3 decades. And we followed students from the state mandated evaluation of that program until they reached about almost 30 years of age. And we found that students who had access to the program, even after controlling for a bunch of differences in student characteristics and family characteristics, were a lot less likely to commit crimes and a lot less likely to be engaged with a paternity suit as a result of the program. So most of my research does look at non-academic outcomes of these programs, and it turns out that when families get the choice to choose the best educational setting for their children, the outcomes tend to be better, particularly when you look at non-test score outcomes, because families care about a lot of other things, such as safety and the culture of the school and the character building that can go on in school, and civic engagement and other types of outcomes as well. So that's a quick background.
A very impressive background. Obviously, you've benefited from this, and we hear a lot of people claim and suggest that school choice is the probably biggest civil rights issue of our time. And if that's the case, can you explain why that's the case?
Well, we have schools that are highly segregated by race and income, and we have vast inequities entrenched in or ingrained in the traditional public school system. We shouldn't even really call them public schools, because they're not like a public park where everybody gets access to the best public park if you can just walk by it. I tend to prefer to call them government-run schools, because they're run by the government, they're regulated by the government, they're geographically assigned by the government, and they're operated by the government and funded by the government. But they're not public in any meaningful sense of the word, in that they discriminate on the basis of zip code. Some of the schools have selective admissions, and they can expel students as well. They don't, contrary to what the teachers union will say, they don't take all comers. And there are huge inequities in that system. And what I argue is that funding students directly would lead to more equity by allowing more families to have access to educational alternatives like the most advantaged already do today. School choice is already available to the most advantaged. They can already afford to live in the neighborhoods that are geographically assigned to the best public schools, quote unquote public schools. They can already afford to pay out of pocket to cover the cost of home-based education and private school tuition and fees. Funding students directly allows for more equity and more liberty at the same time. It's one of the few policy areas where it's a win-win situation for almost every party involved, except for when you start thinking about it in terms of power dynamics with the teachers unions that get your children's education dollars, regardless of how satisfied you are, regardless of the family's choice in the matter, and in this year in particular, regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. And what I like to point out is we already have programs that fund people directly in so many other in areas of life and even other levels of education. Just think about it with higher education. We have the Pell Grant for low-income students and the GI Bill for veterans. With those scenarios, the money doesn't go straight to a community college, and we don't tell the students that they must use that money at a government-run community college. No, instead the money goes to the student, and the student can choose a public or private university of their choosing, a religious or non-religious university of their choosing. Same thing with pre-K programs at the state level and even the federal level with the Head Start program. With those programs, we don't residentially assign low-income families to spend the money at government-run pre-K providers. Instead, rightfully so, the money goes to the family, and again, the family can choose public if they want, but they can choose private, religious, or non-religious providers of pre-K services. And you can extend this analogy in so many other sectors with food stamps. We don't residentially assign low-income families and tell them they must spend their food stamps at government-run, geographically assigned grocery stores, and everybody would be against that, whether you're for or against food stamps and having taxpayers allocate that funding. I think we can all agree on, if we're going to allocate the funding, it should go into the hands of people rather than government-run institutions. Medicaid dollars can be used at Catholic hospitals. The money is directed by the family. Section 8 housing vouchers, they're directed by the family as well. Only when it comes to K-12 education, a lot of the same people who support funding individuals as opposed to institutions with these other programs, they get all up in arms when it comes to the in-between years between higher education and pre-K when it comes to K-12 education. And the only difference is one of power dynamics. The choice is the norm when it comes to higher education and pre-K and all of these other sectors, but choice threatens an entrenched special interest that profits from getting your children's education dollars regardless of your choice in the matter. So they fight really hard against any changes to the status quo because they understand that they want to keep their monopoly, and that's the problem here.
I saw a little bit of it growing up in Southern California, and I think I shared with you an article I did recently, and maybe I'll talk more about this, but I went to and grew up in one of the most affluent school districts in the country in Orange County, which was known for high achieving students, very high test scores, high graduation rates, but it was still plagued by these really powerful teachers unions. And I remember my mom told me, going to my elementary school, I actually wasn't supposed to go to my elementary school. They were able to partake in a lottery. I don't know if it was a lottery, but we were able to exchange with an acquaintance of mine because they didn't want to go to this school. And my mom's like, I want you girls, me and my sister, to go to this school. So my parents were able to participate in some exchange and lottery. I don't know if this still exists, but California was super restrictive, with the exception of maybe some magnet schools and others. But if you were in, like you said, some of these designated zip codes, you couldn't go outside of your zip code. You had to move. For high school, I moved to, I would say, a better area and was able to go to one of the highest performing high schools in South Orange County. That ranked like 9 out of 10 and things of that sort. But with the subject of teachers unions, we see this with Los Angeles teachers unions. We see this in New York, Chicago, everywhere. It seems like they continue to have a monopoly and they're kind of insulating themselves from any competitive forces and subjecting themselves to, let's say, review, to examination, into maybe reassessing their monopoly. I think Professor Jonathan Turley called them essentially a cartel recently. Talk about that, and do you think their power is finally being threatened, or not going to see any challenge to that?
Well, they won when it comes to getting additional federal stimulus. I mean, we've already allocated $67 billion of federal stimulus to K-12 education in the United States, and then Congress just recently passed, at least the Senate passed, the new stimulus plan to allocate $123 billion more in addition to the mostly unspent $67 billion. And the main problem here with all of this is that there's a weird power dynamic when it comes to public sector unions, particularly with teachers unions. They go to the bargaining table with the public school districts, and then they get to bargain with a third party's money, the taxpayers. And if they bargain and come to the wrong deal and hurt their constituents or the families and their children when it comes to advocating for policies that don't lead to better academic outcomes or even in-person instruction, as we've seen this year, nothing really happens if you don't have school choice enacted, because they still have the geographic monopoly. Families can't vote with their feet away from bad policies that are enacted. And we don't have that same kind of dynamic in places with school choice, or if you're looking at the private sector, for example. If a bunch of Walmart employees went on strike tomorrow, it might be inconvenient, but it wouldn't be devastating because I could take my grocery funding to Trader Joe's or Safeway or Whole Foods or another provider of the service. So when Walmart employees go on strike, you can take your money elsewhere. When school employees strike, you should similarly be able to take your money elsewhere, but you can't if you don't have school choice enacted. So the problem there is that the families feel all of the pain when it comes to collective bargaining action, when it comes to the public sector, primarily when you don't have a choice mechanism to provide that bottom-up feedback and accountability by allowing families to vote with their feet. Some people call to abolish public sector unions, but I think a step in the right direction towards including more feedback and accountability for the teachers unions would be to allow for universal school choice. And that way, if you didn't like what the unions were advocating for, you could take your children's education dollars elsewhere, and then at least they would have to think a little bit about the policies that they're pushing for. And in fact, if you look at a study published by the Annenberg Institute at Brown University in 2020, they found that, one, school reopenings were strongly determined by teachers union influence, which I've also found in one of my papers, but they also looked at competition from Catholic schools, which tend to be lower cost private schools. And they found that public school districts, all else equal, with more options for families in terms of low cost private schools and specifically Catholic schools, were more likely to open their doors for business, which lends credibility to the argument that a lot of this whole school reopening debate has more to do with politics and power dynamics and incentives than it has to do with safety. They also found that there was not a very strong link between COVID risk in the area and reopening of schools. Same thing with my study. It's forthcoming at Social Science Quarterly with Christos Makrides, affiliated with MIT. We found, again, that 4 different measures of teachers union strength were strongly correlated with not reopening in person, even after controlling for income in the area, race and age distributions in the area, COVID risk, which happened to mostly not be related to the reopening decisions. And we also found political partisanship was a lot more likely to predict reopenings than anything else as well. So again, look, a lot of this last year has been about politics and power more so than it's been about safety and the needs of families. And families are waking up to this fact. They're seeing that they've been scrambling over the past year, and they're understanding that they're getting a bad deal. Because so many families are seeing that they're getting the short end of the stick when it comes to K-12 education, and because the pandemic has put a spotlight on the main problem with K-12 education, which happens to be a massive, long existing power imbalance between the public school teachers unions and individual families, families are scratching their head and seeing that these closed buildings are continuing to get their education dollars while they're left scrambling. And the latest 2 nationwide polls that I've seen on this have found that nationally, support for funding students directly through different types of school choice mechanisms is on the rise. And in particular, one poll from Real Clear Opinion Research found that in just a few months, between April and August of 2020, support for the concept of funding students directly jumped by 10 percentage points. And that was even among families who had their kids in public schools, wow. Which gives, again, more credibility to the argument that the families are seeing that there's a failure and a problem with the incentives that are baked into the public school system. And the only way that we're ever going to fix that is to fund students as opposed to systems.
So how many states have taken the initiative to fund students directly? I love seeing your updates on this. A lot of state legislatures seem to be taking that issue up. Could you approximate how many have already done so or begin the process to do so?
Yep, and this is another, this lends more credence to the argument that the teachers unions have kind of overplayed their hand in that people are, one, more likely to support school choice now than ever before, and we've seen monumental increases in the support in the past year for the concept of allowing families to take their money elsewhere, particularly if their public school buildings aren't open. But then secondly, there's been a lot of legislative action this year, and EdChoice has a School Choice in America dashboard that shows all the existing school choice programs in forms of voucher programs or tax credit scholarships or education savings accounts, which are all just different types of allowing families to take their children's education dollars to another education provider of their choosing. About 29 states already have something on the books, but a lot of them are pretty targeted and pretty small. Only about 1% of the school-age population actually uses one of these programs nationally. So although a majority of states already has it, they tend to be targeted to disadvantaged populations, either by income or the special need of the student. But if you look this year in particular, there's a lot more massive proposals to allow just about all families to be able to access their children's education dollars. For example, in West Virginia, over 93% of families would be able to have access to their program in the first year, and that would expand over time. Similarly, in New Hampshire, they have a proposal that passed out of their Senate Education Committee just a couple of days ago to almost universally allow families to take their children's education dollars elsewhere. I think it's actually even bigger than the West Virginia proposal. I think it's even closer to 100% of families would have access, according to the House bill version. I think it actually might be a little smaller than the House bill version that's in the Senate, but I'd have to take a look at it. But look, the West Virginia proposal already passed the full House, and yesterday it passed a Senate committee vote now, and now it's on to another committee. And it might be the first one to be a near universal school choice program. So all eyes are on West Virginia right now, but 28 states have had legislators introduce some type of bill that either expands or enacts a new program that would fund students as opposed to institutions. So a majority of states have something in the works that has not been rejected yet. About 9 of those states, about a third of them, have passed something out of at least one chamber, either the Senate or the House. And about a handful of other states, New Hampshire included, has passed something out of at least one committee. So we're seeing a lot of action this year, and there's a lot of evidence that this has to do with the failures of the public school system over the last year. I mean, you're seeing people talk about it, this being the problem. You're seeing in specific bills provisions of eligibility for families who had schools that didn't reopen for in-person, which gives more evidence to the claim that this is about the pandemic and it's about the public schools refusing to reopen and the teachers unions refusing to go back to work. And yeah, there's a lot of momentum behind this year, and I think a lot of people are excited about it. And I just want to reiterate, there's a ton of evidence suggesting that schools can safely reopen and that there is little to no evidence that schools are meaningfully contributing to overall community transmission. For example, in New York City, a school system that has had some of the schools open for in-person instruction, the latest data that I've seen is that the overall community transmission rate, positivity rate, I want to say, is about 6 or 7%, whereas in the schools, the positivity rate is less than a tenth of that. It's about 0.5% in the schools. And you even have Cuomo and de Blasio saying that we're not seeing the spread in the schools and that you see a very low percentage of positivity in the schools. And I think there's CDC researchers as well published in a open network JAMA publication, one of the most well-known publications in medical science, suggesting also that the preponderance of the evidence does not suggest that schools meaningfully contribute to overall community transmission. So we can reopen the schools. The private schools are doing it. So other than the science, we've also seen other things that make a lot of people scratch their head a little bit and say, oh, that seems kind of weird. How did that happen? I think the more compelling arguments that schools can reopen is a lot of the hypocrisy that we're seeing. For example, you have teachers union bosses tweeting about not being able to go back to work in person in Chicago, but doing those tweets from poolside after traveling to Puerto Rico. You have some teachers unions presidents, for example, in Berkeley, California, that railed against reopening of schools, but at the same time were caught sending their own children to in-person learning at a private school. So if it's safe enough for their children, if it's safe enough to travel to vacation in person, then why isn't it safe enough to return to work in person, or at least have your members return to work in person? That didn't make a lot of sense. Another thing that didn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people was that a lot of the same school districts, well, very high number of them from at least a handful of states, maybe even about 10 states or more, just that I can recall off the top of my head, they announced that it wasn't safe enough to return to work in person, so they did the full remote learning thing, and that they said the schools weren't safe enough for in-person instruction. But then they opened the same school buildings in the public school system for in-person childcare services, which begs the question, well, if it's safe enough to reopen, if it's not safe enough to reopen for in-person instruction, why is it safe enough to reopen for in-person daycare services? Why is the learning a big problem here? That what we found out was that the teachers in the public school system were staying at home and they were able to teach remotely because they were still getting paid through the property tax system, and parents didn't really have a choice in the matter. And then they were bringing in employees into these public schools from the private sector, from places like YMCA, and they were more than happy to provide the in-person childcare services. So that's great for the employees that were getting to work from home and the employees that were getting additional funding, but it was horrible for individual families that now had to pay twice, pay once through the property tax system for one employee, and then pay again out of pocket for the employees that were coming in from the private sector, essentially paying two people for the job of one from previous years. And that just goes to show you again that this is more about incentive structures and power dynamics than it is about safety and the needs of individual families. And the families are the ones that are all along have been getting the short end of the stick when it comes to K-12 education. This has been a problem forever in American public schools, but it's more clear now than ever, because it's one thing for your child's school to get your children's education dollars regardless of how well they do, but it's another conversation altogether for them to continue to get your children's education dollars while refusing to open their doors for business. And look, families are seeing this. They're seeing all the hypocrisy. They're seeing the evidence that schools can reopen. They're seeing the private schools fighting against governments for the right to go back to work in person, whereas the teachers unions in the same states are celebrating the decision to keep the schools closed and also kicking the can down the road every step of the way to try to prevent schools from reopening in person. And I want to be clear, it's not because the people in the public sector are different. It's not because that they have bad intentions or bad motivations. It's not because the people in the private sector are any better as human beings. I don't think that at all. I think it's almost universally has to do with the messed up set of incentives that are baked into the public school system. The main difference between the two sectors is that one of the sectors gets your children's education dollars regardless whether they open their doors for business. A lot of people would do the same thing if they were in the shoes of the teachers unions, but doesn't mean that they should do that, and families are seeing that, and so they are advocating for school choice policies, or what I call funding students instead of systems.
It's a good comprehensive view into it. Is there anything else you want to add about your work, or maybe what you're forecasting about this? Because people think this is just like a Republican or libertarian issue, but I would say that people who are on the left are probably starting to discover this. And I did School Choice Week, National School Choice Week blogging. I think it was one of the few events they ever had. It was a lot of us on the center right, and then I met a lot of liberals, I met a lot of libertarians, I met a lot of interesting people, and I was sad that they discontinued that program. But I got to know the issue about 10 years ago doing that, and I saw that it superseded politics, it superseded race, gender, geographic region. Do you think that, let's say, it's going to be more universally accepted and promoted across both parties or all these different movements?
Absolutely. And if you already look at nationwide polling on this, Democrats and Republicans and independents alike, a majority of them support the concept of funding students directly. But when you look at state legislatures this year in particular, and you look at who votes which way, the Democrats almost universally vote against the policies when it comes to in the legislatures, even though a majority of their constituents support the programs. And the problem there is that you have a constituent that is more powerful than the majority of constituents, which tends to be the teachers unions who overwhelmingly donate to one party. You look at the American Federation for Teachers, the second largest teachers union in the United States. You look at the Open Secrets data on this that looks at campaign contributions. About 99% of the contributions went to Democratic candidates in the most recent election cycle. So that's a very powerful incentive not to vote against what the monopoly wants, even though a lot of families that are identify as your constituents who would vote for you support the concept of having more choice in education, particularly when you think about things like this is really a win-win for everybody. It introduces more competition into the market, but then it's also good for families and leads to more equity because let's face it, the most advantaged already have school choice. Giving families the money directly allows for more families to have options and leads to more equity. And it really starts to show the inconsistency in logic when you think about how a lot of the people who will vote for things like funding people directly when it comes to food stamps and Pell Grants and pre-K programs, they change their mindset on funding people directly only when it comes to K-12 education. And again, it's because choice threatens a monopoly only when it comes to K-12 education, but choice is a norm in every other level of education and every other industry, essentially, in the United States. So when it comes to logic, it doesn't make sense. But when you think about the power dynamics, it all starts to become clearer and clearer. And I think this year, more than ever, families are starting to see that. And that's good news.
Yeah, I've seen it with a few progressives I know here in Northern Virginia. One gal told me that she used to, really be a progressive champion. But when the school closures, I think in Fairfax or Vienna, I forget if Vienna, I think some parts of Vienna are Fairfax County, but I think it's largely Arlington. But it hit her directly with her son not being able to be educated. And she said, I think she's open to school choice now. And I see all over my neighborhood open Fairfax County public school signs everywhere with people who have had Biden signs. So I know that, I don't know if it's them necessarily embracing school choice, but maybe they've been tired of kind of accepting what's been conventional and acceptable, although Virginia is a right to work state. And I think I think teachers unions, they exist, but they're not like super emboldened in a sense. Like they can't be too powerful, I guess, with right to work agreements here. But I do see it transcending political lines.
Totally. And it doesn't mean at all that anybody is anti-public school. All of these programs allow you to still choose your public school if that's the best option for you. If you like the remote learning situation that's going on with the public school system this year, you would still be able to choose that, despite what the teachers union wants everybody to believe. And if you think about it mathematically, the public schools actually end up with more money on a per pupil basis when these programs come into play, because schools are funded based on enrollment counts, but they're not totally funded based on enrollment counts. So what that means mathematically is after they lose a student on a per pupil basis, since they get to keep a big chunk of change, they end up with higher per pupil revenues. It's kind of like, just think about it this way. Just think about it, if Walmart got to keep 20% of your grocery bill funding after you left to start shopping at Trader Joe's. Walmart would be happy about that situation, and I argue that the public school should similarly be happy that they get to keep any money at all for students who are no longer being provided with their education services. Similarly, just imagine if a private school got to keep 20% of your tuition in perpetuity, even after you switch to another private school. That wouldn't make any sense, and the private school would be happy about that. So the public school should similarly be happy about the setup that they get, where they financially benefit on a per pupil basis. And another reason for this is because a lot of these programs tie the funding to only the state level of the funding, which tends to be about half of the overall funding. So if your school district spends $15,000 per student, which is the average in the United States in the most recent year that data are available, then you get to keep thousands and thousands of dollars for students who are no longer in your schools receiving an education. And then there are also 28 studies that I know of on the topic, and that several people have reviewed, that almost unanimously find that school choice competition from private school choice programs leads to better outcomes in the public schools too. So school choice is essentially a rising tide that lifts all boats through those competitive pressures, and also partially because the public schools actually financially benefit on a per pupil basis. The other side will try to say that school choice defunds the public schools, to which I'll respond that, well, no, they actually get more money on a per pupil basis. But then two, the money doesn't belong to the schools in the first place. And education funding is meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution, public or private. You would similarly never hear someone say that allowing families to choose their grocery store, if they're using food stamps, for example, defunds Safeway. No one would say that because everybody understands that that money is meant for providing the families with groceries. It's not meant for propping up and protecting Safeway. Similarly, education funding is about educating children, not for propping up any type of educational institution. And another thing, quick response I have to the argument that school choice defunds the public schools, which I talk about in my recent co-edited book with the Cato Institute's Neil McCluskey, School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. This is the biggest myth by far, obviously, but we go over 11 other myths as well, is that this is essentially an implicit admission that the other side, or the defenders of the status quo, understand that they believe when families are given an option that they'll choose something else. What does that tell you about their confidence in the services that they're providing or not to the families? So yeah, go check out the co-edited volume, School Choice Myths, published by the Cato Institute. And also, look, there are no good arguments to fund institutions as opposed to students directly. And I think a lot of families are seeing that this year, and that gives me optimism. Legislators introducing bills to fund students as opposed to institutions also gives me optimism. And so I think, in a sense, the teachers unions have overplayed their hand this year. And in a way, they've done more to advance the concept of school choice than anyone could have ever imagined. And that's something to celebrate this past year.
Yeah, silver lining, I think, to kind of a crummy year. And I think a lot of us were already skeptical of kind of the structure, and many of us, like you, I graduated K through 12 from public school. I was very happy to go to the schools I went to, even with some of the qualms I had with it. I thought I had a pretty good education, and most of my teachers, I think, were pretty exemplary. And without one high school teacher I wouldn't be writing today. She was very inspirational to me and gave me the confidence to become a good writer. And yeah, I mean, many of us who support school choice graduated from that system. We want the system to succeed, and we want parents to have choices for their kids so that they don't fall behind. And we can definitely revisit this in another conversation, but it's so sad to me that the merit-based schools, I think there's one here in Virginia, they want to reassess their admission system, not so much make it on merit. They want to kind of choose different metrics for admission, which is very lamentable. And just all this other stuff related to education, about books you can teach about, or content that should be examined or reassessed. But Corey, where could people follow your work? Obviously, you plugged in the book. I will include that in the notes. But where can people follow your work and connect with you on social media?
Follow me on Twitter. It's at DeAngelis Corey, just my last name and then my first name. And if you want to see my longer form articles, you can find those at the Reason Foundation website or the Cato Institute website. If you just type in Reason Corey, or Reason Foundation Corey, or Cato Institute Corey on Google, you'll find all of my longer form work there. So yeah, thank you so much for having me today.
Of course. And I hope we can meet sometime in the DC circuit when things are a little less chaotic. I really appreciate your perspective. I really admire your work, and I'm grateful that you can come on and share your expertise, because I know bits and pieces, and I'm pretty yoked into this issue, but you are so well versed in it. And I think everyone would benefit to learn more about school choice, about directly funding students from someone like yourself. So I'm grateful that you spoke with me today.
Thank you so much. Happy to do it anytime.